Welcome back. In the previous lecture, we saw a definition of argument as a connected series of sentences, statements, or propositions, where some of those sentences, statements, and propositions are premises, and one of them is a conclusion. And the premises are intended to give some kind of reason for the conclusion. In this lecture, we're going to look at the purposes for which people give arguments, because the purposes are crucial in determining what an object is. Take, for example, an artifact that you might find in an archaeological site. You won't be able to figure out whether it's a really big screwdriver or a really small spatula unless you know whether the people who used it intended it to screw screws or to pick up food that they were cooking. So to understand arguments, we need to understand the purposes for arguments. And that means, why does somebody bother to give an argument instead of just asserting the conclusion without an argument? Well, just think about it. If you went to a used car lot and the salesman said, "You ought to buy that Mustang," would that convince you? Not a chance. But if the salesman said, "You ought to buy that Mustang because it looks really cool and it goes really fast," or maybe it has great gas mileage, or whatever, and gives you a series of reasons, then you might be convinced to buy the Mustang. So that's one purpose of arguments, to try to convince you to do things or to believe things that you wouldn't otherwise do or believe. So this purpose is persuading or convincing. And if you think about it, what the salesman's trying to do is he's trying to change your mental states. He's trying to make you believe something that you didn't believe or do something that you didn't do. So he's trying to bring about an effect in the world. But that's just one purpose of arguments. We don't always act like salesmen. Sometimes, instead of trying to change people's beliefs, we're simply trying to give them a reason for their belief or for our belief. And to give them a reason is not necessarily to convince them or persuade them or change their beliefs. When we're simply trying to give them a reason to believe the conclusion, we're going to call that justification. So imagine that your friend, you're not a salesman, you're a friend. Imagine that your friend is thinking about buying a car. He doesn't know which one to buy. You might say, "Well, I think you ought to buy the Mustang because it looks really good and it goes really fast and it's actually got pretty good gas mileage and it's quite reliable," or whatever. You're not necessarily trying to convince her to buy that car. It'd be fine with you if she bought any car she wanted, any car that would make her happy. You're trying to talk about the reasons for buying the car so that she can make her own decision. In that sense, you're trying to justify that decision or that belief that the Mustang is the best car for her to buy, and not necessarily to convince her or persuade her. If she comes up with great reasons to the contrary, you're perfectly happy, whereas the salesman wouldn't be. But notice that you might give exactly the same reasons that the salesman did, exactly the same argument that the salesman did. The difference lies in the purpose, because the salesman is trying to convince her to change her beliefs and actions, but your goal with your friend is to discuss the reasons for her decision or action. So you're thinking about justification, and the salesman was thinking about persuasion. Now, it really matters whether your goal is justification or persuasion, because there's a big difference here. If you're trying to justify your friend's belief or your friend's action, then you're trying to give her good reasons. The salesman can convince her or persuade her with bad reasons. So it doesn't matter to his purposes whether the arguments that he gives are any good or bad, as long as they work to affect that change in the world. Whereas you care about whether your arguments and your reasons are good reasons or arguments because you're trying to justify that belief or that action. And of course, people can try to do all of these things at once. They can mix them together in various ways, and that can get complicated. So when someone gives you an argument, you need to ask a series of questions. The first thing you need to ask is this person trying to change my mind or change my behavior? If so, then their goal is persuasion or to convince you. Then you need to ask, are they trying to give reasons for changing my mind or for believing if I already believed it. Well, if they're doing that, then their goal is justification. And if you go down that series of questions, you'll be able to understand what the purpose of giving the argument is, at least for this range of cases. So let's do a few exercises just to make sure that you understand justification before we go on to the next purpose of argument, which will be explanation.